The flames of war were never far from Japan's soil, and in the 17th century, one rebellion dared to challenge the shogunate itself. It began not with armies or banners, but with whispers of injustice, of starving peasants, and of samurai stripped of their honor. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled with an iron grip. Its power stretched across the islands, binding lords and warriors alike under strict control. The shogun demanded obedience, and for decades he got it. But in the southwest, far from Edo's glittering palaces, discontent grew. The people were crushed under heavy taxes, while farmers barely had enough rice to survive. Samurai, once proud defenders of their clans, found themselves dismissed, wandering without masters, their swords symbols of a fading past. Among them rose a young man who would become a legend, Amakusa Shiro. Barely 16, he spoke with a fire that ignited the hearts of peasants and masterless samurai alike. He promised freedom, justice, and a chance to strike back at the shogun's tyranny. He was no ordinary rebel. Many believed him touched by the divine, chosen to lead his people. And for a moment, it seemed as if destiny itself had given the samurai one last chance to defy the shogunate. The rebellion began in 1637, in the province of Shimabara. The people there had suffered worse than most. Their local lord, desperate to pay his debts, raised taxes beyond reason. Families sold their children just to survive. When the shogun's officials arrived to take more, desperation turned to fury. Farmers grabbed farm tools as weapons, ronin, the masterless samurai, unsheathed their neglected blades, and they followed the boy who promised hope. The uprising spread like wildfire. Villages that had once lived in fear now raised banners of defiance. Samurai who had sworn never again to fight found themselves drawn back into battle. Old grudges against the shogunate resurfaced. It was no longer just about taxes. It was about dignity, survival, and the dream of a world where the shogun's rule could be broken. The rebels marched under crimson flags, their numbers swelling into tens of thousands. At their heart stood Shiro, calm and fearless. His charisma bound them together, convincing farmers to stand shoulder to shoulder with warriors trained in the art of war. It was an army unlike any the shogunate had ever seen. But the shogun would not ignore this insult. From Edo came the command, crush them without mercy. Troops from across Japan were called, tens of thousands of seasoned soldiers under the banners of loyal lords. They would march on Shimabara and end this rebellion before it could spread further. And so, the stage was set. A boy prophet leading an army of peasants and samurai against the might of the shogunate. A storm was gathering over Japan, one that would test loyalty, courage, and the very meaning of honor itself. The rebels chose their fortress, the ruined castle of Hara, perched on a cliff above the sea. There, they would make their stand. The fires of rebellion were lit, and soon, the greatest clash between samurai and shogun's power would begin. The sea crashed against the cliffs below Hara Castle, a steady drum for the rebels waiting on its walls. Winter pushed through broken hulls. Farmers gripped spears carved from bamboo. Ronin tightened old armor with rope. At the center stood a quiet captain named Hayato, once sworn to a minor lord, now sworn only to survival. He had seen enough wars to know the shogun's answer would be heavy. Across the fields, banners of the shogunate gathered like storm clouds. The first commander, Itakura Shigemasa, was proud and impatient. He believed the rebels would break at the first charge. Scouts warned of numbers inside Hara and the unity of peasants and samurai under the boy leader, but Itakura brushed it aside. A rumor is not a wall, he told his officers. No one dared say the wall was real, and ready. Before dawn, drums rattled and ladders rose. Wind off the sea shoved smoke into charging faces. On the ramparts, Hayato counted heartbeats and gave simple orders: save arrows until you see the crest, push ladders with poles, do not chase. The first wave fell back. The second reached the stones, and for a breath the castle vanished behind a forest of shields. The defenders answered together. Ladders tipped. The drums slowed. Itakura demanded another charge. Pride would not allow retreat. The mud deepened, and men grew wary of a fortress that refused to shiver. In the confusion, a hidden gate opened and a burst of defenders surged out, grabbing sacks of rice and hauling them inside before the line could close. When the sun broke through the gray, Itakura's camp looked shaken. Rumors raced, the boy Shiro spoke like a spark, but the rebellion's edge was discipline. Inside the castle, food was rationed. Salt was treasure. Yet spirits held. A teenage girl who'd lost her family brought tea to the wall and told Hayato stories to keep him awake. He remembered only the human warmth in a place of stone and wind. At night, prayers rose in shattered rooms. Some crossed themselves, others bowed before small altars. It did not matter. Everyone wanted the same thing, a future not decided by distant men. In Edo, news of failure landed like a hammer. A new commander, Matsudaira Nobutsuna, was ordered to end the siege with patience instead of pride. He brought engineers to cut off water and grain, and letters reminding nearby lords where their loyalties should rest. One letter reached a coastal magistrate who had been letting fishermen slip dried fish to the rebels at night. He stared at the seal and understood the tide had turned. The next day, fences rose around supply routes. Watch fires doubled. Drums in the Shogunate camp kept a confident beat, a promise that time would do their work. Inside Hara, Hayato opened the last bales of rice with his father's knife and split portions with steady hands. No one complained. They had chosen this stand. At dusk, a foreign ship appeared on the horizon, sails thick as clouds. Officers in the Shogunate camp smiled thinly. The plan now involved thunder from beyond Japan's shores, cannons that spoke a language everyone understood. Hayato watched the hull cut the black water and knew the siege had entered a darker chapter. The foreign cannon spoke before sunrise. Thunder rolled across the water, and black smoke lifted as iron tore into the castle walls. Stones cracked, timbers splintered, and the defenders pressed flat against the earth, praying the storm would end. This was no ordinary firepower. These guns had come from traders on distant shores, eager to keep favor with the shogunate. For the first time, the rebels felt the weight of a world outside their island pressing down upon them. Amakusa Shiro walked calmly through the shattered halls. His voice never rose above steady words. Walls can fall, but hearts do not, he told them. To starving peasants and weary warriors alike, it was enough. They rose again, patching breaches with earth and broken carts, turning wreckage into barricades. Each night, the boy leader climbed the ruined tower, lifting his banner where the enemy could see. In the shogunate camp, officers grew frustrated. How could peasants defy cannons? Matsudaira Nobutsuna, the new commander, was not reckless like Itakura. He tightened the noose. Any villager caught smuggling food faced swift punishment. Spies were planted to spread despair inside the walls. One morning, the defenders awoke to leaflets scattered by the wind, promises of mercy if they surrendered, threats of death if they resisted. The rebels burned them in silence. Inside, conditions worsened. Rice was gone. Bark from trees was boiled into bitter soup. Children cried themselves to sleep, their voices thin in the cold. Yet no one spoke of opening the gates. Among the fighters, Hayato noticed something strange. Men who had once despised farmers now fought beside them without hesitation. Ronin who had lived in shame now found a cause worth dying for. Hunger did not break them, it bound them tighter. Then came betrayal. A small band of defenders slipped out under the cover of night, carrying messages that promised to guide shogunate troops through a weak point in the wall. They were caught before they could escape the cliffs. Panic flared in the castle. If some could betray, who else might be tempted? But Shiro gathered the people in the courtyard and spoke, not of punishment, but of unity. One hand alone cannot lift a blade, he said. But together, we are stronger than iron. Outside, Nobutsuna studied the situation carefully. He knew time was his weapon. The rebels were starving. Their strength was fading. But he also feared that each failed assault only raised Shiro's legend higher. Some of Nobutsuna's own men whispered that the boy might be protected by the heavens. The commander tightened discipline, knowing rumors could wound an army as surely as arrows. Winter deepened. Frost clung to the stones, and breath turned white in the air. In the rebel campfires, people spoke less of victory and more of endurance. A girl who had once carried tea now stood guard with a spear. Farmers who had never left their villages became hardened warriors in weeks. Hayato saw it in their eyes, this was no longer rebellion. It was transformation. But the shogunate was patient, and the cannons were not silent. Each day, the castle shrank under fire. Each night, the rebels rebuilt with bleeding hands. The balance of power had shifted, and though the spirit of resistance held strong, the tide of war was creeping closer to its final storm. The question now was not if the castle would fall, but how long the samurai and peasants could hold against a nation determined to erase them. The siege entered its cruelest stage. Food was gone, water scarce, and the rebels lived on roots, grass, and whatever scraps they could boil into bitter broth. Mothers pressed empty bowls into children's hands, pretending there would be more tomorrow. Yet still, no one opened the gates. The banners of Shiro fluttered on the ramparts, a stubborn splash of crimson against the winter sky. Matsudaira Nobutsuna studied Hara Castle from his command tent. He had the men, the guns, and time itself on his side. But each failed assault had cost him dearly. He could not afford another disaster like Itakura's. So, he changed tactics. No more reckless charges. Instead, the shogunate built walls of their own, siege lines encircling Hara, cutting off escape completely. Trenches and palisades rose, turning the besiegers into jailers. The rebels were trapped in a cage of wood, steel, and fire. Inside, desperation bred daring. Hayato and a small band of ronin crept out through a hidden tunnel one night, slipping past the watchfires. Their mission was simple: strike the shogunate supply wagons and steal rice. They moved like shadows, blades flashing in silence, seizing sacks of grain before slipping back into the darkness. For a brief moment, the starving defenders tasted food again. Hope returned to hollow eyes. But Nobutsuna expected such raids. The next time, his men lay in wait. When Hayato led another sortie, they ran into an ambush. Arrows rained down. Several rebels fell, and Hayato himself barely escaped, dragging a wounded farmer through the mud as cannons roared overhead. They staggered back into the castle with nothing but loss. From that night onward, the tunnels were sealed. The cage grew tighter. Shiro never wavered. Standing in the ruined courtyard, he reminded them that their suffering was proof of their courage. "The shogun fears us because we endure," he said. His words worked like fire on damp wood, slow to catch, but once lit, burning bright. Even as hunger hollowed their faces, the rebels held firm. Meanwhile, in the shogunate camp, divisions simmered. Some lords complained about the length of the siege, the endless drain of supplies, and the shame of needing foreign cannons to break peasants. Others argued that allowing the rebellion to survive this long only encouraged unrest elsewhere. Nobutsuna silenced them with cold logic. When they fall, it must be absolute. No spark left alive. The rebels sensed the tightening grip. Each day brought new barrages from the cannons. Stones split, roofs collapsed, and bodies were carried quietly to shallow graves. Yet every blow from outside only made the defenders cling to each other more fiercely. Farmers and samurai who once lived worlds apart now shared the same suffering, the same defiance. One night, as the sky burned red with cannon fire, Hayato stood beside Shiro on the rampart. The boy's face was calm, almost otherworldly. "Do you think we can win?" Hayato asked. Shiro did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Victory is not always living. Sometimes, it is showing the world that we cannot be broken." Below them, the shogunate line stretched endlessly, a sea of tents and banners. Above them, the stars flickered faintly through the smoke. Inside the walls of Hara, the rebels braced themselves for what everyone knew was coming, the final push, when the shogunate would throw everything into breaking their spirit once and for all. And yet, even as doom loomed closer, a strange thing happened. The legend of their resistance began to spread beyond the battlefield. Rumors carried by fishermen and travelers reached distant villages. Peasants whispered that samurai and farmers stood together at Hara, holding back the shogun's armies. The rebellion, though trapped, had already become more than just a fight, it had become a symbol. The morning of the great assault came with no warning. A signal drum thundered across the fields, answered by the roar of cannons. Smoke rolled over the cliffs as the shogunate army surged forward in wave after wave. Their ladders clattered against the walls, shields locked tight, spears thrusting upward. Inside Hara Castle, the rebels sprang to their posts. Farmers hurled stones, boiling water, anything they could grasp. Ronin met the first attackers with steel, blades flashing in brutal arcs. Hayato, his arms trembling with exhaustion, cut down one assailant after another, refusing to give ground. For hours, the fortress shook under the clash. The shogunate soldiers pressed harder. They had learned from earlier failures. Instead of charging blindly, they advanced in disciplined ranks, protecting one another from arrows. At several points, they gained the walls. Fighting turned into chaos, close, desperate, face to face. Peasants with sickles faced trained warriors, and the stones ran slick. But the rebels would not break. Again and again, ladders were cast down, fire pots thrown onto siege towers, shouts echoing across the battlefield. By nightfall, the shogunate had gained nothing but loss. Hundreds of their men lay scattered across the mud. The rebels still held. Yet victory brought no celebration inside the castle. Hunger gnawed deeper than ever, and the wounded filled every chamber. Supplies of bandages and herbs had long since vanished. Farmers tore strips from their clothes to wrap wounds. Children sat silent beside their parents, too weak even to cry. In his tent, Matsudaira Nobitsuna paced. He had underestimated their resolve. A single defeat might have broken any other force, but these rebels fought like people who had nothing left to lose. He realized then that brute strength alone would not win this war. He needed patience and precision. Let them starve, he told his officers. Steel has failed. Hunger will not. The siege tightened further. Water sources were poisoned, fields burned, and every approach sealed. The shogunate even blocked the sea with watchboats, preventing fishermen from sneaking supplies. The cage had become unbreakable. Inside, hope flickered faintly but refused to die. Amakusa Shiro walked among the people, thin and pale himself, yet still radiant with calm. The shogun fears us, he reminded them. Every day we endure is another wound to his pride. His words carried power, but Hayato could see the truth in their faces, strength was fading. Then came a rumor that shook the rebels. A group of samurai within the castle spoke in whispers of surrender. They argued that to resist further was to invite annihilation, not only for themselves but for their families. If they opened the gates, perhaps mercy could be bargained. When Shiro heard this, he called the samurai before him. He did not rage. He did not beg. He simply asked, "Do you believe the shogun will spare you after all this?" None could answer. They all knew the truth, surrender would mean death, just slower and more shameful. Still, doubt had entered the fortress. Hunger was the shogunate's sharpest weapon, and it was cutting deeper than any blade. Even Hayato, hardened as he was, wondered how much longer they could last. Yet when he looked at Shiro, standing firm against despair, he clenched his fists. If they were to fall, then it would not be with bowed heads, it would be as warriors, united. Outside the walls, the shogunate prepared for something larger than another simple assault. Siege towers rolled closer. Cannons were positioned in a circle, ready to fire together. Matsudaira planned not a battle, but an obliteration. Inside, the rebels tightened their belts and whispered silent prayers. They knew the next strike would decide everything. The ground shook as the cannons fired in unison. A wall of fire and smoke wrapped Hara Castle, stones leaping into the air like sparks. Siege towers rolled forward, their ironclad hides shrugging off arrows. The defenders braced themselves, battered by the thunder of foreign guns. Hayato fought on the ramparts, sword arm numb, shield arm bleeding. Every step forward by the shogunate was met with desperate resistance. Farmers wielded spears carved from gate posts. Women carried buckets of rocks to the walls, hurling them down at the climbing soldiers. Children relayed messages where adults had fallen. It was no longer a war of trained fighters, it was the war of survival. By midday, breaches opened in the walls. Nobutsuna's troops swarmed inside. The fighting turned into chaos within the courtyard itself. Hayato found himself surrounded, blades slashing from every side. Then, with a furious roar, a band of rebels charged into the fray, pushing the attackers back long enough to reseal the breach with barricades of wagons and corpses. The rebels had held, barely. But the cost was unbearable. The castle stank of blood and smoke. Half the defenders lay dead or too wounded to stand. The starving survivors looked to Shiro, waiting for his words. The boy stood pale against the crimson banners, his voice quiet yet unbroken. The shogun has not beaten us. Every day we still breathe is victory. Yet privately, even Hayato wondered if hope could survive another attack. Winter deepened. Snow fell across the battlefield, covering the dead in silence. Inside the castle, hunger became an enemy greater than swords. People chewed leather straps, scraped moss from the stones, even boiled grass in the last drops of water. Infants starved in their mothers' arms. One night, a group of rebels attempted escape. They slipped from a ruined gate and crept toward the sea. But the shogunate watchfires spotted them. Cannons boomed, and screams echoed across the cliffs. By dawn, their bodies were dragged before the castle walls, displayed as a warning. Still, Shiro refused despair. He gathered the survivors in the courtyard, his banner behind him shredded but still flying. If we die, he said, we die as one. The shogun will never forget that farmers and samurai stood together against him. And neither will the people of Japan. Hayato saw tears on hardened faces. Even the most hopeless clung to those words. They had nothing left, except pride. Nobutsuna, watching from his command tent, understood that fear of death would not break these rebels. So, he plotted their end in silence. He gathered his generals, ordering a massive final strike. Every soldier, every cannon, every ounce of strength would be hurled at Hara Castle. Not to win, but to erase. The final assault began before dawn. Drums thundered. Cannons roared without pause, blasting the walls into rubble. Shogunate troops surged forward in an unbroken tide, shields raised, ladders clattering against the ruins. Inside, the rebels met them with the last of their strength. Hayato fought like a man already dead, slashing, parrying, driving his blade into one enemy after another. Beside him, farmers who could barely stand still swung their makeshift weapons. Children threw stones with their tiny hands. The courtyard became a storm of fire and screams. Barricades fell. Roofs collapsed. Rebels fought from room to room, each step a struggle bought with blood. Shiro stood in the center, calm amid the chaos, his voice carrying above the din, "Stand, for you are the last free men of this land." But the shogunate's numbers were endless. For every soldier cut down, 2 more pressed in. By midday, the rebels were forced into the inner keep. Smoke filled the halls, choking breath. Flames licked the banners until only blackened scraps remained. Hayato staggered, his blade broken, his body cut. Around him, the last defenders clung to each other, refusing to bow even as death closed in. And still, Shiro did not waver. The inner keep was surrounded. Nobutsuna himself rode to the front, watching the final collapse of the rebellion. He had given no order for mercy. The shogunate's plan was simple: wipe them out to the last soul. Inside, the rebels knew the end had come. Yet there was no surrender. Farmers embraced their families, whispering prayers. Ronin tightened broken armor and stood shoulder to shoulder. Hayato, bleeding and swaying, gripped his shattered sword and looked once more at Shiro. The boy leader raised his hands. Our bodies may fall, but our story will rise. The shogun's victory today will forever be shadowed by the courage of those he could not break. Moments later, the final charge thundered through the keep. What followed was slaughter. The defenders fought to the last, each one cut down in the smoke and fire. Amakusa Shiro, the boy who had defied an empire, vanished in the chaos. His body was never found. Some said it was burned, others that it was hidden to prevent his legend from growing. But legends cannot be buried. When the smoke cleared, Hara Castle was nothing but ruin. Tens of thousands of rebels, farmers, women, children, and samurai, were gone. The shogunate had its victory, but at a price it could never erase. News of Hara spread across Japan like wildfire. The shogunate declared triumph, yet whispers carried a different story. People spoke of farmers who had stood against the greatest army in the land, of samurai who had fought not for lords but for justice, and of a boy prophet who defied the shogun to the very end. The rebellion was crushed, but its spirit lived on. For generations, the name of Amakusa Shiro became a symbol of resistance. The shogunate, though unshaken in power, could never silence the tale of Hara Castle. Every peasant who paid heavy taxes, every samurai stripped of honor, remembered that once, just once, the mighty shogun had been challenged, and had trembled. Hayato's fate was unknown. Some say he fell in the final charge. Others whispered he escaped into the smoke, carrying the memory of his comrades so the world would never forget. What mattered was not whether he lived, but that the story endured. The siege of Hara was over. The rebellion had failed. But its legend would echo through the centuries, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers can be defied by the courage of the desperate. And so ends the story of the samurai versus the shogun, a tale of honor, sacrifice, and a fight that outlived the swords themselves. Thank you for watching this epic journey into history. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of warriors, battles, and forgotten legends. Until next time, stay strong, stay curious, and remember, history is never truly silent.